Thank you, Neeraj. We don't all have to stand up. I just couldn't see half the room, so I thought it would be easier to do it that way. But thank you once again, Lily. Thank you, Neeraj. My job here is principally that of a moderator, and I try to push the conversation along as forward as best as we can. As Neeraj pointed out, we have an esteemed panel here, consisting of people whose responsibility it has been or it still is to change the picture and to help people overcome, the constraints that they might be facing because of where they're born. And then we also have two people from the world of academia who have looked at this subject from an anthropological point of view, from an economics point of view, and of course, not limiting their examination of this subject to their own disciplines, but trying to integrate insights from, a whole world of knowledge. At one level, and I'm not going to, take more than maybe 30 seconds at the beginning, because the panelists, would delve much more deeply into the topic. But to maybe just frame the conversation a little bit, at one level, what we're talking about right now is obvious. It does make a difference, whether you're born in Mirzapur or in Mumbai or in Varanasi or Vasant Vihar or wherever in this country. And I think the constraints that people experience get more and more acute as they are distanced from where resources could come from, where information, expertise, knowledge, opportunities all exist. But at another level, it's much more complex, and it probably needs deeper examination into why people might suffer, or we might hear today that there might be certain advantages in being born where you are, even though you may seem to be disadvantaged at first glance. And then, of course, we'll try and devote some time into how, if there are constraints in terms of a person's ability to fulfill their aspirations in life, or to simply for themselves, their families and communities achieve a quality of life that all of us aspire to, then how could we possibly go about it? And therefore, without much further ado, I'd like to invite you first, Alkaji, if you could share your thoughts. We'll do one round, given the constraints of time. If we could, share our thoughts in about 5 or 6 minutes each, that would be wonderful, because that will give us more time as we go on. You've looked at the problems of people very, very closely in the positions that you've held, and among your other thoughts, if you could just share some insights in terms of how there might have been attempts into looking at a citizen-centric approach, and how we might have been able to make decision-making a little bit more inclusive, helping people and communities overcome location-based constraints.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be back in this room with these thoughts. Was away for almost 2 years, and great to reconnect with everybody. So, sticking to the topic and sticking to the time, I'll just start with, because the thought is how is local very important today, and how we need to strengthen the local structures, because where you are born should not really mar your opportunity. And mobility obviously has a lot of advantages, but at the same time, the problem of mobility and the social structures and economic structures that exist are most often not favorable for those at the bottom of the pyramid. I'll just take a cut to COVID times, and that was the time when we saw how our local supply chains, or how our local community strength came to the rescue whether be it dealing with the migrant crisis, whether be it dealing with how to handle the migrants, their food, how were they to be lost because there was a scare, whether people would be able to get back into the villages, and there were a lot of adverse stories that went around. So that was one. But at the same time, we also saw globally, while the market value chains broke down, supplies really badly broke down, we here in India, because of our local strength, were able to do a fair job. And I'll say this by giving one example. Things like face masks, which were so important at that point in time, the US did not have face masks for the longest time, and there was a long waiting period. Here in India, within I think days, the supplies came in, and I remember many of our women organizations coming to the fore first with the cloth mask, then there were the mesh masks, etc., the surgical masks, etc. We were able to take it forward. Going back to testing facilities, because of our local interventions, because of our human strength that we have, manpower strength that we have in the country, in various places we were able to handle that as well. So there is a lot of merit, but at the same time, this local resource that we have, or as I was reading, the pin code problem, the pin code has to be strengthened, and for which the point that you were trying to make, how to make it more effective, citizen-centric, economy-centric. So let us not forget that whenever we talk about communities, mobilities, something that is very important is how do we develop these value chains locally. And now cut to my present role as Secretary Animal Husbandry, it is something beautiful that I have seen. The work that NDDB is doing and Amul is doing. So they all started with milk collection locally. They started with milk processing in the vicinity. Then they had have these bigger plants which are run by Amul or many other dairy cooperatives. But again, it's the entire pyramid. It's not only the value chain, but it is the strengthening of the pyramid which becomes important. So NDDB then came up with with something called it's known as IDMS. They produce all the apparatus and they produce all the requirements for the dairy sector or the chilling plants or the processing plants. So they are doing it locally. It is one, quality controlled, two, it is cheaper, and three, it is employing a lot of local manpower. The third thing that we are doing is employing the local people. So whatever we do, we will need to have these considerations in mind that the local population which is there will have to be engaged in this entire process of value chain building. Talking about citizen-centric, citizen-centric, all these issues of social security are very important. But for that, it is important to bring the governance structures in the hands of the people. We have the PRIs, we have the 73rd Constitutional Amendment, we have the urban local bodies, but what has turned out to be more effective is the collectives of women, the National Rural Livelihood Mission, which is spanning across the entire country. Charanjit has been ably leading it for the last so many years. And that has become the actual strength. Now, you have the human resource at one point, at one end, which you're trying to motivate, which you're trying to organize. But how long do you hold the community fabric in place by just socially mobilizing them? To keep them together is also important. It is also important to give them something to do, give them certain more powers, certain more responsibilities and accountability. And that will happen when the government starts closing down the gap between the service delivery on one end and number two, provide them with financial assistance, financial incentives to build their own organizations. And now today, I'm very happy to mention over here, in the women's cooperatives, about 60 lakh farmers are there. 60 lakh women farmers are there. but the number of positions that they hold on the board is much lesser. We need to get these women into the boardroom. And when I say women, because I wear that hat and I wear that body of a woman, so that is why it comes to my mind. So decision making has to be done, has to be given to them. Number two, the other point that I have in mind is when we have the governance structures in place, the community needs to understand what is it that they can provide and what is it that they can take back from these community structures. So on one end you have the social delivery, the social programs that can be better administered with better delivery, but at the same time we also get to know what are the social schemes or what are the government schemes are which we can align to our own needs. So Radban was once, because Anish I think did mention it or you mentioned it, as far as Radban is concerned, this is one model of the government which was fairly successful in conglomerating activities and local areas together, building strength to have some kind of a structure which brings in the strength of the area and which brings in the strength of the local communities. We have seen very successful urban clusters. Some are doing horticulture, some are doing very good in floriculture. In Sikkim, I have seen some of these urban clusters doing very well. So, an organized approach to the communities where there is a good give and take both, I think would be very necessary. To conclude, I think I have overshot by 1 minute. I wanted to conclude by 2:41. Just to conclude, all of this will need intervention, long-time intervention. We need to do the area approach. We need to work in an area for about 4 to 5 years, because that is the lead time required for developing models. And then that models speak for itself. So an intensive strategy for building these models would be very important.
Thank you so much, Kali. Yes, we should. Thank you for those very, very insightful remarks. I would like to, hopefully we'll have time to pick up on the theme of localization, particularly in terms of how we discover opportunities. Local solutions, my guess is, can be millions, but they need to be then discovered locally and not sort of prescribed, from what we would normally call top-down. I think the importance that you placed on institutions, people as institutions, as an alternative. What struck me was the role that I think government, for sure, and then maybe institutions such as civil society organizations have to play in helping people's institutions, women's institutions become bridge builders and not become the bridge ourselves. That could get people across, the gulf that might exist. Which is probably a good note to then invite you, Charanjit Singh Saab, to share your thoughts. One of the principal aims that the Ministry of Rural Development has had at the Government of India level, reflected in numerous schemes, is to help bridge the divide, bridge the gulf, and to make services of all kinds, right from information to tangible products, accessible to people. Mobility has been one outcome of this. We have many millions more moving from rural areas to urban areas in the hope of building a better life. But if we were to take, once again, a place-based approach, focus on the location, then have we done enough? Is there more that we can do? Anything you'd like to highlight? Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, I think we have got such an enlightened panel. Madam Alka is also here because we have worked together for a long time. So it's nice to be here and sitting on the same panel. It's a nice feeling. So first of all, I like your heading. Change the picture where you are born. So that topic is very close to my heart, and we were discussing it also a few days back. The people are not poor, the places are poor, basically. So I will give you just one example. The same job of plumber, which is being done in Colloquy district in Odisha, he is getting X amount of money. He moves to Bhubaneswar, he gets 2x. He moves to Delhi or Bangalore, he gets 5x. And he moves to Switzerland, he gets 25x. So the same job is being done and how the things change. So the opportunities are very important. So I feel that we need to make some sort of interventions which enhances the value of that place so that they can get the same, not the same, but a reasonable amount of money from that very place. So I will just give you one more example why I am saying. We are, as Madam mentioned already, we are working on the collective solar movement. So we have got this Balini milk producer company in Bundelkhand area, that is the Jhansi, etc. area. So that is very backward area. So there we formed one company of the women. So I will just give you some figures so that you get the flavor of the thing, that how the things are going on. So we have got this company where we have got 7 districts, which cover around 1061 villages. And there are 66,000 members, all women members, all board of directors, all women, and they are managing this. So we started this company in the year 2019 and their turnover is now 588 crores. So this is the amount they have moved in the economy. So we are addressing the whole value chain. And one more thing, and their per day milk collection is now 1.80 lakh liter. So this is the amount of the money that is being rotated in the economy. So we are tackling the every step of the value chain. So just making a company is not enough. So what are we doing? We collecting milk is one thing and then chilling it and selling it to the big company, separate thing. But we are tackling them, we are teaching them green fodder production, cattle feed availability, mineral mixture availability, artificial insemination, then ration balancing program, clean milk production training, infertility camps, CMT tests, then ethno-veterinary practices. So all those things are being taken care of. And now we have moved one more step ahead, last year only. We have signed the MOU with 4 banks. That is the Bank of India, State Bank of India, Punjab National Bank and Bank of Baroda. Now we are facilitating the finance to these rural women so that they can buy the cattle, etc. So I am happy to say that within 1 year, 9 crore of finance has been made available to these women, and then they have provided more than 900 women have been facilitated like this so that they can buy more cattle also. So this was really empowering, and I went to one of the villages in that area. So I got to interact with one of the women. That was a really very thrilling experience for me, and I felt that I am really doing something good for the society, that what difference our intervention can make. One lady came to me, she said, sir, आप लोगों ने बहुत ही अच्छा काम किया। मैंने हमने क्या अच्छा काम किया, एक कंपनी बना दिया। उससे कहता नहीं सर, आपको पता नहीं मतलब इससे क्या डिफरेंस हुआ। मैंने कहा क्या डिफरेंस हुआ? वो कहती सर, मैं एक शेड्यूल कास्ट फैमिली से कहते कि बिलोंग करती हूँ, तो मेरे को कहते कि अपना जो जीविका चलाने में ही बड़ी दिक्कत आती थी। कोई मेरा दूध भी कहते कि लेने को तैयार नहीं होता था। तो जब आपकी कंपनी आई तो मैं डरती डरती वहां गई जहाँ कहते कि दूध लेते थे। तो मैंने जाके पूछा कि आप हमारा दूध लेंगे? तो उन्होंने क्यों नहीं, यहाँ तो कोई भी दूध दे सकता है। तो कहता कि सर उस दिन मेरे को इतनी खुशी हुई और इसके साथ साथ मेरे को इतना फायदा हुआ, मैंने एक नई भैंस खरीद ली है और अब मैं अपने बच्चे को एक बहुत बढ़िया स्कूल में कहते कि एडमिशन करवा। सो दिस इज द इम्पैक्ट it makes when we make right kind of intervention. So that we need to look at that what type of interventions are required, and if we work in a collective form, I think that can make a lot of difference. So this was my one point. Second point is that we need to work together, because मैं तो कहता हूँ गवर्नमेंट अकेले नहीं कर सकती. We need as many partners. मैं भी लंच पे भी कह रहा था कि we need as many partners as possible. Only then we can make a difference. As our honorable Prime Minister said, that we should have the whole of the government approach. Why there should be whole of government, whole of society approach? हम सब लोग मिल के अगर एकजुट होके अगर कुछ काम करेंगे, only then we can make a difference. And I will just give one more example. अभी मैडम बैठी है तो मेरे को ख्याल आया immediately. So we have got this Pashu Sakhis. Pashu Sakhis are basically community resource persons who give hand holding in the veterinary sector. So we have got around the 60,000 Pashu Sakhis, those who live in the villages and they provide hand holding. So we have got one good amount of interaction with the animal husbandry department. तो हमने notes वगैरह exchange किए कि what type of training we are giving and what type of training should be given. They said, okay, your training is good. We are giving 42 days training, but 16 days more training is required. जो आपके left out things are there. So we converged with them and then we did the 16 days more training. Now they are being recognized by the animal husbandry department also, and then they are providing the extension services in the rural area. So देखिए अगर दो डिपार्टमेंट ही मिल गए so that we can make a lot of difference. Now they are saying that we want 2 lakh such Pashu Sakhis. जो 60,000 तो हमारी है ही है, and we are going to train 1,40,000 more Pashu Sakhis like this, so that we can make the intervention across. So this is the I think power of convergence and working. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. Thank you for that example, because I think in very tangible form it brought to light how you can enable, how you can empower, and how you can bring about transformation, not just in the lives of a few, but in thousands of women with what we are tempted to call again and again an intervention, but I think it's much more than just an intervention. Two things struck me. One, about getting the economics of it right, and whether it's a small business or it's a collective that's working in a value chain such as the dairy value chain. I think we need to get that right, and then it was also very, very clear that you need to get the institutional side right. Because an opportunity might present itself and there might be a viable proposition from an economics point of view, but unless the institution or the right kind of institution gets into the picture, things are not going to change. If I could cross the line for a moment, it's an area of work that is of great interest to us at Development Alternatives. In fact, we look at building what we call collaborative institutional ecosystems. How do you get actors of all affiliations together to work collaboratively? I'd like to invite you now, Dr. Raina, because economics and institutions are probably what you've looked at most intensively in your work, also again from a people's point of view. If you could share your thoughts with us. I believe there are a few slides that might help. Yeah, is it possible? Neeraj, do we have them? Yeah, so if you could just display them. And again, in about 5 or 6 minutes, if you could share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks to you, Shashtant, and the DA team for inviting me to this. It's been again, as both these panelists speak, it's such a world of learning there from what the state is doing now, and also, the ways in which some of these, let's say, interventions again, which were thought of as impossible especially with rural women, are now taking off in such a big way in this country. I want to focus on 2 things. One is, what we see as a conventional development view and how these interventions are actually challenging what we see as a conventional development view, bringing in some stories that I've learned from in the field. So I'm going to focus on two concepts: questions of variability and mobility. What works in Bundelkhand need not work in, let's say, parts of Telangana or in the Northeast. Yeah. So let's take the idea of mobility also. It's not just a question of a pincode, right? It's also a question of what kind of changes, that is, what kind of mobility do we want? Yeah, the move from, let's say, a part of Orissa to Switzerland is, of course, a big mobility. But it's not just that kind of mobility that we're talking about. We're also talking about a rich and, again, sustainable and resilient mobility. And I'm really, really grateful that you told us the story about the milk producers company now and the efforts it's putting to the pressure circuits. To the next slide, please. Can I have the next one? Yeah, so I just want to emphasize that a lot of these locational issues, especially discussed in India, have challenged conventional development economics thinking. And what we see in the field now, well, especially through the work of several civil society organizations, several others also, small companies, the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, and tiny little, not up to scale, but yes, several of these examples are actually drawing on some of these concepts that have challenged this conventional thinking. Ultimately, what is given to us as rural in development economics is supposed to dwindle and shrink, and as the country develops, the rural is supposed to become insignificant, both in terms of the workforce, that is the share in the workforce, and two, in terms of value added. Fortunately, that has not happened in India yet. Yeah? So we have an immense potential to do something that is completely new and sustainable in the world of development itself, not just in terms of this country and our rural areas. So there's a big potential. I'm going to get to these details of who said what, but the best example that we have in India is Joseph Kumarappa, who was one of the Gandhians, who spoke about a village-centric economy. Next one, please. Sorry. So just to redo this again, that even some of our latest, the Fitosi Commission, for instance, which was commissioned by the President of France to say what are the other ways of valuing the world, the economy, said that what we need to measure and value differently. I'm so grateful that you mentioned value, sir, because the idea of value is something that is so deeply set in our minds that we don't even realize where these come from. Yeah? So let's not also, just as a deviant here, let's not forget that what we see as corporates and corporate values is something that emerged as a new institution established during, that's noted, during the second industrial revolution. The industrial revolutions, the first and the second, happened without the corporate sector. Yeah? The corporate sector emerged during the second industrial revolution for various reasons. Let's not get into that. So there are ways in which we can actually reimagine institutions and create new ways of working. Next, please. So I just want to emphasize two things. Two messages. One is that rainfall India, I'm not talking about a pincode, but a vast area of India that has less than 40% of assured irrigated land, that zone area, has been in the spotlight for not just big states and suicides, and not just that, but for various other reasons. Next slide. So the question of poverty, you map the same thing, the same distribution of poverty over rainfall areas, rainfall agriculture, and again, uplands. Yeah, the next slide, please. So when we look at each of these, well, let's say actors and the ways in which the state is addressing this, we find that the Ministry of Rural Development has made far more, well, let's say, innovative interventions in rural India, in agriculture, than the Ministry of Agriculture has. I'm not comparing ministries and arguing for one for the other, but just saying that what is it that gives the Ministry of Rural Development, well, let's say, the scope and the ability to do something that's far more, well, gainful for rural India compared to the Ministry of Agriculture. One is that it recognizes these so-called material territories, not just a pin code, material territories and the immaterial territories. So, Watershed Development Committee, women on the board of a cooperative, these are all immaterial territories. This is where the state has made some of the most magnificent institutional changes, which unfortunately we don't recognize, we don't celebrate. I think we should. Yeah? So whenever we look at these, well, let's say these combinations of changes, we have to see that these are actually critical changes that the state is making, again, not alone, in partnership with several other organizations, several other rural development organizations, state governments maybe, but also the NIRD and other organizations like that, with civil society organizations as the one that we have just studied now, looking at civil society organizations and their work in India 1980s to 2010s. We just finished a project sponsored by Food Foundation, where we saw several of these actors, development alternatives, yes, I mean, I've seen their work, worked with them and some of these things. Tide, which is a small organization in Bangalore, again, worked with the Indian Institute of Science and their digesters and stoves and so on. Society for Energy and Environmental Development, Vivekananda Institute of Biotechnology. These are all organizations that provide, on the face of it, provide technologies. Yeah? But look at what they do, well, behind the scenes, right? It's enabling a range of institutional changes, training women, SC/ST populations, building new markets, creating inroads, enabling a different kind of valuation. A Pashu Sakhi is somebody who becomes a different actor just because of the knowledge that is built into that person. Yeah? That is an institutional change. That is not just a giving them a sprayer or a pesticide or something like that, not an artifact. And how is that possible? By putting in the right kind of public investment. In agriculture, what we see is the supply of subsidized inputs. In other arenas, especially in livestock development, as you know, ma'am, it's been such a brilliant story of successes here, and in rural development, there is still a much greater scope to put in public investment and trust people to do the right thing. That's actually the major difference in development approaches, something that we should talk about, and work on improving the immaterial territories, building village-centric economies, village-centric, again, not just village-level economies, but a national economy that is built on a village-centric principle of value addition, changing the value chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anna. I think that distinction that you made was very, very important. That we're not talking about village level, which is a trap. It's a trap, as you mentioned at the very outset, that we might fall into because we're sort of conditioned to believe that rural is going to get smaller and smaller, and then village economies will become more and more insignificant. So to not treat with a village-centric approach in those terms, but to actually see how it could be a million mutinies of sorts all coming together to transform the nation. Amish, I'm sorry we've kept you waiting. You're an anthropologist, a social anthropologist, a person who's been studying people for your professional career, but much more, particularly in terms of how that understanding of people interfaces with public policy. So, what I mean, if I could, put a leading question to you, what changes have you seen? Are we influenced by what people want, what people need, their aspirations, etc.? Or are we increasingly influenced by that, or is there a separation that seems to be going? Avnish.
Thank you, Pat. And first of all, let me thank TRI and the organizers. It's a pleasure and pride to be here. Let me also confess that what I am doing is the easiest job to deliver a lecture. People who are implementing it's very difficult. What I'll do in 5 minutes, I will share my 3 learnings, which are basically ground level understanding. The first one, of course, when Jivika got started, and there was a study which I was doing in Bihar. Jivika, when I say SRLM, and my basically humanistic approach of anthropology allowed me to explore, what do people really think about when Pat asked me about. So I set a question that what women really feel when they say that they are empowered. So there are a lot of literature, Western literature, which will agree on empowerment, and we have been using women's empowerment as a discourse. And I'll just make it very simple, and this is already a published article and so forth. With 6 months of my field work in one of the poorest districts in the villages of Barachetti, which is in there and so forth, my understanding, and then it was tested also in some other parts of India, that what rural women see as an interplay of rise of identity and income, when it is in tandem, it reduces insecurity at different levels. And that's what they count as empowerment. I'm not getting into semantics. What I'm trying to get into is people who are implementing on ground, they actually lack the purpose what they're implementing. Sometimes we are caught up with the products and set of activities. So what I realized that what Jivika or what SRLM and NRLM has done, they have actually built not only self-confidence with the mobilization, but even state has regained confidence. I'm sorry to say, but if a rural woman goes to bank, she may not get loan, but today she can get. So that's the change they have brought in. not only on the confidence, self-confidence, but even the state's confidence on their ability. But what I would also like to say is that now the stage is basically moved from mobilization to marketability. And that second study which I would like to bring is from one of the cooperatives of 30,000 women working in Rajasthan on dairy, and also the another one which I did for the Maharashtra government, which is basically a collaborative study. What it comes to that even the Jivika, I did some organizational analysis that what leads to citizen-centric governance. What it makes very simple that if the strategy is first governed by the governance principles, which results into a strategy which is more purpose, which drives to product, and then if we go into some form of marketability, that and these three when they are actually combined together, they give social legitimacy to the community. The second thing which comes when we talk about the different actors, because there is another program in Maharashtra which I did the assessment called GDGS, which is basically for corporate, the government of Maharashtra, and NGOs and CPOs on the ground. Now there was a question which was placed by you that how synergistic approach can work. Now my understanding, which is going to come in EPW very soon, it's already going to be published, it says that in short, that if you can identify the mutual strain between the actors and the equitable gain, then only this collaboration works. Otherwise it don't work. And unfortunately, to work on synergy, we do not have corpus as far as resource is concerned to manage that partnership. And what I mean by partnership, my understanding says that partnership is not about contractual relationship. Partnership is about realization of my strength and weaknesses and the strength of the other actor with whom I'm going to partner. So with these two realizations, only the partnership works. Now, the third thing which I would like to share is very quickly that I also delivered in Indian Science Congress where I was invited to deliver the Platinum Jubilee lecture. This was also presented to Niti Aayog actually. My current research, and which I would like to seek your inputs as well, that why in India every community who possesses traditional knowledge is poor. And my hypothesis is, and I've done some, sorry, but I have to be a bit critical as well, that if you look at skill development program, there's hardly any focus on building the traditional skills. It's misnomer that if my identity is around my traditional knowledge and place, I should be poor. There is many calculation which can look into how to unleash the potential of these kinds of skills which are untapped today. So what I'm trying to say is, let's say any art form, any craft, there is a market to it. Now how do we link it? How do we standardize it? How do we make it quality assurance? Is something which might lead to, but this is something which I would like to explore more on this before I justify. So the last thing which I would like to say very quickly is that we are at a stage when mobilization is now at a threshold. Now unless until it is actually substituted with income, it may be in danger because women and maybe rural collectives, be it SHG, be it cooperative, be it VOs, federalism, what a federal cooperative, whatever we talk about, that is something leading to some change. Now, if I see at a macro level, now if you see number of villages, approximately 6.3 something lakh villages, out of which there are around 50% of the rural villages which I am talking about, are in roughly 16 states. Even if you go for 50% of the total number of villages, there are only 7 states. Now, government has started this aspirational districts and so forth, which are very dedicated to this platform. Now, what I'm making a point, and largely they are so-called those traditional BMRO states along with West Bengal. Unfortunately, West Bengal has not taken over the aspirational district program, but that's different, which we will not be discussing today. What I'm trying to focus is that, and there are ample studies which says, be it the determinants which are not the good determinants about out-of-pocket expenditure and so forth, like health and education becoming one of the major reasons of poverty, they fall under these 57 districts, approximately. So if we can actually focus on the district level interventions or area-wise intervention with certain forms of traditional skills and knowledge, which can leverage and leads to some kind of economic gain and empowerment, then there will be a different gain. What I want to conclude with is that somehow I believe that the policies are basically driven by market. Like all these skill program which we are doing is either for some standardized kind of income generation. We have induced some form of guarantee through placement, but that is also guaranteed for 3-4 months. Like sir was talking about, that there is a differential appreciation in terms of economic gain as well with respect to where you work. Now, there are technologies which can bridge this gap. Now, there was another question which I was asked too, that how we can partner with CSR and we can actually lead to some form of a change. You know? I was given this question that how business can be collaborative. Now, CSR is approximately 18,000 crores since last 2-3 years, roughly. I'm talking about the PAT one and the profit after tax, but there is much more than that. But what is that business is looking for, which I have understood from some of those part of the reasoning, that there are two things which business looks for. Are you able to improve their risk appetite? As simple as that. And the risk is of environmental degradation, it could be of exclusion, it could be or any form of some form of unregulatory measures which they can actually carry forward. And it is not only about the private sector, it is also about the PSUs also which are facing this. The second thing is that what they are looking for, that we only look at CSR, but it's a very big misnomer for if you look with the business perspective. Because business houses are in real mess today because there is a sustainability fund, there is a ESG fund, there is a CSR fund. Unfortunately, they have not realized that at the core of it all they have to have a confluence. Because they talk about sustainability. And if you count roughly, if a company is investing 100 crores on CSR, roughly 200 crores in sustainability, and another 200 crores in ESG. Now, what is the strength which we can borrow from current situation? Now, ESG, that is the environment, social, and governance component, has become an instrument of investment. Most of the investors are withdrawing money from the companies where they are not following it. What companies need from development sector is, one is of scale, and then second is that how scarce resource, because how they make money out of it is that can be managed. So my thinking is that if we can think about different actors, if we are playing in terms of even identity, income, and insecurity, let's say with PRI, with the cutting edge staff who are working on ground, and also with the CBOs, how do we rise their identity? And identity is not about self-identity within the household, even in society. So you talked about SC/ST women, and my study says that NRLM has actually, in public space, improved much more identity of a woman from the scheduled caste community, whereas from the higher within the household, sorry. And if you talk about in the society, the higher caste women have gained much more as far as identity is concerned. Because the constraints of higher caste women in participation of public discourse. So what I would say is that if there is some understanding about how this identity is moving, and if that place can become a dividend with some form of acknowledgement to the traditional knowledge, then it can lead to not many gains, and it may not be a stigma. Because what I want to conclude with, that anthropological literature says very clearly that how do you diminish, not diminish, but how do you add achieved status to the ascribed status? Ascribed is the inherited status, be it of gender, caste, or whatever ethnic group or place you. Now, how do you add to achieved status, be it income or whatever you can do with status? So that results into more cohesive society. So I'll close it here, Pat, and if there is no question, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. If I'm correct, we have about 15 minutes left for this session. Is that okay? Can that be negotiated? Okay. I'm not even looking at this side of the room. Thank you, panelists, all of you. And I think one of the things that I'm most grateful for is that we didn't look at problems. In fact, in all of your comments, I think you were looking much more at strengths. One of the things that we've learned, in our work is that you really shouldn't adopt a problem identification approach, which tempts you into finding solutions. So the problem solution framework doesn't exist, but look at things more from a strengths and initiatives, basis or a perspective. So thank you all for doing that. There is one thing that I'd like to touch upon, simply because we'd agreed that we'd explore it a little bit in the session, which is that if we're talking about a location-based approach, right, the focus being there, and we're talking about greater inclusion, more local decision-making, local opportunities being tapped, so on and so forth, then there is a synergy or collaborative behavior that needs to get exhibited between at least three kinds of entities that Transform Rural India had honed in on, but I think all of us would agree. One, and I'm making this specific to women's initiatives now. One is your self-help group or the village organization or the community level federation. The second is the Gram Panchayat itself, or maybe slightly higher order institutions, and then there's government, as in the administration. So very quickly, because this we see as a place where you might be able to unlock, or unleash several things. Any thoughts any of the panelists might have on how these three could work, more collaboratively, more purposefully? I don't want to get into then products and marketability necessarily, but the women's institutions, the Gram Panchayat, as in PRIs, and administration that I'm highlighting that also because that's where a lot of the resources are controlled, by way of funds at least. Yeah, okay.
So since I was reading up today morning itself, so I'll first start with women, their role in PRIs, and then governance, and strictly in that order. Case of Kerala, National Rural Livelihood Mission, preceded by their own Kudumshri program, and which has led to such a higher representation of women in the PRIs itself. I do not have the numbers right now, and I might err in taking any number, but probably the women's representation is much higher than the prescribed 33%. It is much higher. To my mind, it is something like a 60%, but I'll refrain from using that number. So that is one, and let's not talk about administration as administration. Let's think about it in terms of governance. So thereafter, the PRIs and the role of women in several organizational forms and managing them. It's being done by women. That is one example. The second example, and of course, the societal strength of women empowerment in Kerala is a little different, but nevertheless, the Kudumshri and NRLM have worked a lot in that direction. The second example that I was reading up today was this case of Telangana, where the number of women in the dairy cooperatives is very high, and resultantly, the representation in the panchayats is also very high, and I do not have evidence because it just ended up over there in terms of panchayats. The participation in electing the members of panchayats goes as high as 80-85%, and the representation is also pretty high. So those are the two things that immediately come to my mind. And thirdly, all these cooperatives that we are talking about, the women's cooperatives, the milk producer companies, I think women are showing the way by taking decisions. And those decisions are at this point of time being espoused by professional agencies or government, and they're doing a very, very fine job. Balini is one example, and several other cooperatives and several other such milk producer companies, they're doing this job. In fact, out of the 22 producer companies which have been promoted, 15 are all women, and about 107 in these all women, or rather all of these, there are 172 directorial positions, of which 150 are occupied by the women. So I think connecting the dots, we are moving in the right direction, and we will need to invest more and more in building these collectives of women.
Thank you. Thank you. As you were speaking, I was wondering whether one reason might be that women tend to be more connected to place than men in terms of being rooted and also connected among themselves in probably a richer way of sorts. Any of the other panelists, not necessarily on this aspect, but other thoughts that you'd like to. We have about 5 minutes before we open the floor.
Okay, just I want to add one more thing regarding the identity. I fully support your viewpoint that this identity thing has really worked very well. So last year only in Madhya Pradesh there were local body elections, those who Panchayati Raj institution. Now around 17,000 women from this SHG ecosystem have been elected to panchayats, then Janpad Panchayat is at block level and Jila Panchayat. So this is the power of the identity. Now they are moving out of the house and then they are occupying the positions also. And I will tell you one more story. I have got many stories. I think that makes the thing interesting also. So I met one of the women who was a Jila Panchayat member. तो मैं उसका वो करने लगा इंटरेक्शन में लगा तुम कैसे बन गई जिला पंचायत तुम तो एसएचजी की member सर मेरे को क्या है कि सभी एसएचजी की बहनों ने कहा कि तुम खड़ी हो जाओ तुम्हारे खिलाफ कोई नहीं खड़ा होगा तुमको निर्विरोध कहते कि जिताएंगे तो कहते मेरे को तो ऐसे ही उन्होंने जिता दिया तो कहते कि मैंने कहा ये तो तुमने बहुत बढ़िया किया तो कहती सर अब तो मैं सोच रही हूँ नेक्स्ट ईयर मध्य प्रदेश में इलेक्शन होने जा रहे हैं तो मैं एमएलए का इलेक्शन भी लड़ूंगा ये है पावर.
Yes, please, Satish. Just take the mic. Yeah.
I think one way to look at, certainly there is a drastic change with the grassroots mobilization of SHGs. And one way which we can look much beyond the impact which we have created is one, of course, representative form of governance, like how many women are there in the institution. The second is that how they are determining the participatory form of governance. Now, be it social audit and even determining some form of the political agenda at the local elections. So I have personally witnessed so many SHG groups. They are saying better sign this agreement and then we will vote for it. So there is a kind of transformation of politics which is taking place. The second thing which I would like to bring it is that there is an intergenerational impact of this collective. Now every woman who is part of the collective is trying to invest a precious resource in education and well-being of the next child. One thing which I just want to add, it is not about limitation. My understanding of what women suggested, that they don't want to be in role conflict. So what you said, Pat, they want to perform their domestic role. I'm talking about rural women. And then I calculated the distance which can cover up for their livelihood as far as place of occupation is concerned. It's somewhere around 7 to 9 kilometers because what they say is that we want to perform the role which is of basically the household as well as income as well. Now this allows the association with the place, whereas male migration, the data already is very obvious that economic and professional and income migration is much more dominant. So that's what I say.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Anna, I have a question for you that we got online, so may I just add this and then with whatever other points you take. The question was why we deliberated on the locational disadvantages. Are there examples of locational advantages which the government, market, etc. need to support for people to flourish locally?
Thank you. So yes, there are several locational advantages. I mean, I showed the picture of Rainfall India itself as an example of how this whole subsidy-driven, irrigated, chemical-intensive agriculture is not what works in Rainfall India. Yeah? What works is good public investment, locational advantages that sprout from the variability. That is, I mean, we don't realize that Rainfall India produces almost all about 80% of the livestock products in this country, right? So it's a whole range of high-value products that come from Rainfall India. So there are locational advantages that people are living with and producing well. It's just that the risk is too high and the state needs to invest differently for this. So that's a small example. But there's also another big example, again from the livestock sector, pastoralism. Pastoralism builds on variability and mobility.
And the pastoral communities in this country are not insignificant. The massive populations of cattle and people move along and right up to the Himalayas and back from Gujarat, through the Deccan, through the eastern plateaus, and there are lots of pastoral communities in this country. The point is that they are all building on variability and mobility. Again, the state seems to either ignore them or harass them. So there's very little that is done in support of them. We've heard about cases where government has given them now, that's a very, very good initiative by our government, which has given them, well, identity cards and also helped them access health facilities and facility to stay on the way as they migrate. But these are things that the state can do, and these are again location advantages that mobility gives people, the state can give people. I just wanted to add one point since you mentioned the Kudumbashri example, and I was a student in Kerala, I'm from Kerala, when this whole experiment took off, it was so difficult to convince the state that this kind of, well, let's say, an institutional innovation is important, not just for well, let's say, women, but for the state itself. To get responsible women into the field, to make them work, or help them work in ways that they choose to work. Now they, of course, run a whole range of other activities too, not just the conventional Kudumbashri role that they were assigned. Now, the point is that institutional innovations, again, I remember when the first devolution happened, that is a financial devolution in Kerala, giving 40% of the budget to panchayats, to the Gram panchayats to make decisions. Everybody said it's going to fail, but look at how it has succeeded. That is, of course, it's in terms of the state budget, it's still a poor state, but it's a state that actually does very well in terms of Gram panchayat expenditure and accountable expenditure. At least at that level, we know there is very little corruption, right? I mean, the higher levels of corruption we come to talk about, but we know that things work, and that is because of the women there, because there are women and accountable women in positions of power within these systems at the ground level. And I think that is perhaps the one thing that I would recommend, enabling the mobility of women from the self-help groups, as you said, sir, into forms of local governance, wherever possible, whether a cooperative board or a Gram panchayat, it doesn't matter. It has to happen.
Thank you. And I think that's come through as a clear pointer in terms of how we could move forward. We have 3, 5, maybe 7 if I keep ignoring this side of the room, minutes left. I'd like to just open the floor if there are very, very quick questions. Yes, sir.
I'm Deepak Maheshwari from here. Just 2 points. One was we did mention about the urban and other in terms of locations, and this is something that reminded me of Dr. Kalam's model also, which was providing urban amenities in rural areas. And talking about women collectivism, and I still remember the movie Manthan of Shyam Benegal, which again had Smita Patil as the main protagonist in that particular movie. But more than that, I would say that the other important thing, much before the term crowdsourcing, crowdfunding became popular, that particular movie itself was made with contribution of 2 rupees each by those milk producers. So that's again something which shows us the power of collectives.
Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. Any others? There is one question that we got online again. I'm just holding it back because we need another session to address it. Yeah. But it was, since I don't see any more hands, we'll conclude with this one, and it was, sorry, yeah, of course. I have an advantage, I'm half blind, so it's very difficult for me.
I wasn't holding my hand up, I was so tempted, but I was like, it's half baked in my head, but I thought I'll throw it out there. I feel like, considering that, and there's a session on 8, particularly for young people, but I feel like, where does all of this leave young women, particularly? Because I think, particularly when you look at identity, there's so much of aspiration, yet there is so much of different kinds of identity they're holding out. I mean, they're expecting to be part of technology, they're expecting to study, yet at the same time, what is the social institutions or sort of as an ecosystem that is being built for young women? And I'm just wondering, anyway, that's where do we go from there?
Just very quickly, are there examples where young women in particular?
In fact, Charanjit mentioned one. He talked about, sorry. So Charanjit just mentioned about one such example, the A-help or the Pashu Sakhis. So you see, increasingly with the kind of economy and technology-based delivery systems which are coming in, will need a new kind of hand. I'll take the example of dairy sector and because that's what I do, so that's why the examples come back again and again. So in say about 10 years from now, the women, and it's 70% women who do the dairy business or they tend to cattle health, etc. These women, that cohort, would be getting older. They will not be able to sit down on their haunches or on the knees to be able to milk the cows. Now, for that, we will need technological interventions. So across the world, you have robotic, milk yielding things coming in. At the same time, you need better animal husbandry, for which this A-help kind of an institution is there. We also have the Krishi Sakhis. So this is the educated lot, but as ma'am said, rooted to as he said, they are rooted in where they were. So the median distance that you travel is much lesser. With the advancement of technology, we will need more such people to take care of the needs of the local communities, and I see this is where these women or young men of the community will be taking their roles.
I think that's another thing that came out quite clearly. There is a new knowledge and skills economy that exists that's needed in villages of India, which we haven't looked at closely enough.
And we have to build business models out of it.
Absolutely.
So I totally accept your critique on not very good scaling programs which are practical, but at the same time, if you have scaling programs which are attuned to earnings, I think therein lies the success.
Dr. Raina, very
Just
quickly.
one point. I mean, I like the question, but it's also something that really troubles me, given the kind of, let's say, opposition that we see to young women entering new markets and new opportunities for livelihoods and just going out and having fun in rural areas. So that's something that has to be countered in this country through directly addressing caste class questions, patriarchy questions. It's a very, very big problem, and I think the more we acknowledge it and we say, well, these are things that young women face, the better we will be prepared to confront it when we face it in the field. Like you said, implementing is a completely different ballgame. Yeah? So we have to be prepared for this, and young women are facing this on a daily basis. Wherever I see this in the field, I keep telling them to.
Confusing times for them.
Absolutely, it's really confusing
We're
times.
asking, sorry,
And we have
we're
to.
asking them to, go be out there, be aspirational, other at the same time they're conformed in the same system.
Yeah. And again, coming back to your point about Kutumbashri, the first phase of Kutumbashri also faced this caste class questions. There'd be women from Nair households, for instance, who would say, well, I mean, even if they were poor in terms of the economy, just the caste thing would say, oh, why should I go out and work with these other women? Yeah. But then, as Kutumbashri took on and it became a big movement, women from all walks of all castes and all patriarchal cultures, matrilineal system by the way, but even then, they started working together then. So I think it's important to confront these mistakes.
Thank you.
30 seconds. Because I just put it
29 seconds.
Well, I'll take only 20 seconds.
I think one thing which can be talked about, not only pertaining to women, but largely, but that is beyond now what we are discussing. But what I believe is in the context of livelihood in rural areas, one of the most important things which is done is that these women, when they engage with the collective, they bestow an example of aspiration and inspiration in the young. When you see that my mother can do it, I will do it. And that's what is happening now. So what I think is, I don't want to close it with some critique. What I would say is that this is something exceptional. Pat, I don't think NRLM has ever documented this. But I saw in every review meeting of SRLM, there is no caste identity. In India, it's very famous that you can take only kacha food and pakka food between the caste hierarchies and so forth. But it's the only place other than marriage when even the higher caste eats from the lower caste. And that's the contribution of SRLM.
Very good. Okay. On that note, I apologize to our panelists because we just can't go further. But I will read out the question for next year's Indian Rural Colloquy. This was to Alkaji, but it was villages and change. Villages are changing and transforming. In your experience, what are the different policy dimensions that governments need to observe and work upon for providing improved opportunities for rural
So I
India?
think that's a session.
Session at next year's Rural Colloquy. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, audience. You've been wonderful. Patient, I must say. And hopefully, we covered a lot of ground. And I'm sure the one thing I'm confident about is that we, got, fascinating insights that will help all of us in our work. So thank you very much.